If you've been following the North Korean saga over the last few years, you've definitely seen it all. The fire and fury, the tweets about, bigger nuclear buttons, and then those historic handshakes in Singapore and Hanoi.
Total whiplash.
Yeah.
And usually in a geopolitical drama that big, you expect China to be front and center.
Exactly. The big brother who holds all the cards conducts the whole orchestra. But then something really strange happened. China went quiet.
Just silent.
For about a year, right? While Trump and Kim Jong-un were grabbing every single headline on the planet, the world's rising superpower seemed to just sit on the fence. They were dormant.
It really looked like China passing. That was the term everyone was using. The idea that Beijing had been sidelined, left out in the cold, while the real players finally handled business.
And South Korea was working feverishly to make a deal happen, but Beijing, they seemed totally content to just watch from the sidelines.
And there's a vivid, almost gritty Korean idiom for this.
Right, blowing your nose without using your hands.
It sounds messy, doesn't it? But in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, it is the ultimate power move. It's the art of getting everything you want while keeping your hands perfectly clean.
As it turns out, China wasn't being ignored at all. They were watching a plan fall perfectly into place.
While the U.S. and South Korea were focused on the really difficult, almost impossible task of denuclearization, Beijing was quietly making this very nuanced shift.
They started prioritizing their own long-term influence over the exact goals the Trump administration was chasing.
And when the Hanoi Summit finally ended in that spectacular collapse, all of a sudden that Chinese silence felt very intentional.
It felt like a cold reminder to Washington, right? Like they were saying, you can dance with North Korea all you want, but in the absence of Beijing, you will fail.
That's precisely it. So the question we're asking today is, why did China choose to become a ghost at the negotiating table? And maybe more importantly, how did they manage to win a game that everyone thought they had been kicked out of?
That is exactly what we are diving into. This whole period, this intense, direct U.S. North Korea engagement, it was defined by these grand gestures and sudden reversals.
Yeah, and it exposed this fascinating and frankly highly effective strategic shift in Beijing.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that, to unpack the nuanced approach China adopted, which involved moving from being this, visible, active mediator
to a stabilizing force, one that exerted maximum strategic influence precisely because of its seemingly passive posture.
Right. We need to analyze exactly how this action through inaction, or I guess strategic patience, aligned perfectly with South Korea's immediate need for stability.
And at the same time, how it advanced China's long-term regional goals. It's really a masterclass in strategic prioritization and, leveraging the underlying power dynamics of the region.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of this calculated inaction, because, when we were all watching the news during that time, China seemed completely absent.
Right.
The whole narrative was that the U.S. and North Korea were finally talking, without the old gatekeepers. So from Beijing's perspective, what was the calculus? Why let go of their traditional role as the primary host and mediator?
Well, the perception that China was sidelined only really holds up if you assume China's main goal was just to have a seat at the table.
Which is what most people assumed.
Exactly. But if you look at the evolution of China's diplomatic role, you see they effectively transition from being the lead actor to what some researchers have called the stabilizing anchor.
A stabilizing anchor. Okay, that's a really interesting conceptual shift.
It's huge. Historically, China hosted the six-party talks. They were the center of gravity, the ones setting the table.
Right.
But when these direct talks emerged, Beijing saw an opportunity. They could redefine their involvement from active mediation, which is, very costly in terms of diplomatic capital and carries a high risk of failure.
You put your reputation on the line.
Right. And they shifted to passive stabilization, which is incredibly low cost and offers a very high yield.
That feels a little counterintuitive. How do you actively manage the boundaries from the wings without ever actually stepping onto the stage? Didn't they risk letting the U.S. dictate the tempo and the terms of the whole negotiation, potentially to China's detriment?
And that's the critical question. That's what defines the sophistication of this whole strategy. They banked on a single premise.
Which was?
That the core interests of all the parties, Pyongyang, Seoul, and Washington, they all converged on one immediate necessity: avoiding war.
And that necessity became China's leverage.
Precisely. I've seen some analyses from retired Chinese researchers, people like Lao Zhao, who spent his entire career focused on these dynamics. And He views China's strategic silence not as a forced retreat or a sign of weakness,
But as something else entirely.
as a profound expression of strategic patience.
Okay, tell us more about that, Lao Zhao's perspective. What does he mean by strategic patience in this specific context?
For him, the core realization in Beijing was that the U.S. North Korea dialogue, regardless of whether it ultimately succeeded or failed, served China's immediate security goals perfectly.
So the process itself was the win.
The process was the win. He argued that China's role evolved from the primary mediator, the person who has to force a compromise, to the stabilizing anchor, the necessary element that prevents the whole structure from just drifting into chaos.
Okay.
He points out that the real power of this action through inaction, lies in maintaining the boundaries of what's possible. China's quiet presence, just by being there, maintained regional security. It ensured that the dialogue, even if it got volatile, could happen without dragging the peninsula back to the brink of a military conflict.
They became the ultimate backstop.
The ultimate backstop.
That distinction is so key. Mediator versus backstop. A mediator has to spend resources. They have to risk failure. A backstop just has to exist.
Yeah.
But has China always been this good at pulling off this level of strategic silence? I mean, were there times in the past where they failed to sit back and it forced them to spend a lot of political capital?
Oh, absolutely. Think back to the period after the first North Korean nuclear test in 2006.
Right, or the Cheonan sinking incident in 2010.
Exactly. During those really volatile moments, China was often forced to play the role of the reluctant enforcer. They had to visibly lean on Pyongyang to maintain stability, or they had to actively mediate between the U.S. and South Korea to stop things from escalating.
Which is public, and it's costly.
It's diplomatic heavy lifting, and it often alienated either Pyongyang or Seoul, or sometimes both. In contrast, during the Trump-Kim summits, China realized something. They realized the U.S. was effectively doing the heavy lifting for them by negotiating directly.
And Kim Jong-un was already highly incentivized to keep that testing moratorium going, just to keep the dialogue window open.
Precisely. So China could simply sit back and, collect the benefits.
So in this case, the diplomatic process itself became the product, and the actual outcome on denuclearization was almost secondary.
For China's immediate interests, yes.
And we can see this reflected in just how well the events, as they unfolded, satisfied China's foundational goals for the peninsula. What are those foundational sort of non-negotiable goals for Beijing?
Well, China's policy really has three foundational non-negotiable pillars when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. And what's so remarkable about this period of U.S. North Korea rapprochement is that the diplomatic shift satisfied all three automatically, without China needing to lift a finger or, get into any contentious negotiations.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's start with the first one, which is always the most urgent.
Number one is preventing conflict. For China, this is the absolute existential priority. They share a long, porous border with North Korea, and any large-scale conflict presents just catastrophic risks.
You're talking refugee flows, environmental contamination.
And most critically, the potential for a U.S.-led military presence right up to the Yalu River. So the dramatic shift from the 2017 fire and fury rhetoric to these high-level summits was an immediate, successful diffusing of that military tension.
The simple fact that the U.S. president and Kim Jong-un were shaking hands in Singapore meant that for the first time in years, the risk of a military invasion or a preemptive strike was essentially off the table.
It was neutralized, and that achieved China's primary goal right there.
That makes perfect strategic sense. You diffuse the immediate threat without having to directly pay the price of the negotiation. So what about the methodology for dealing with the issue?
That brings us right to number two, resolution via negotiation. China fundamentally seeks to resolve international disputes through dialogue and multilateral frameworks, not through unilateral military force or regime change.
So the diplomatic track that Washington and Pyongyang were on, centered around face-to-face talks and summits, it aligned perfectly with China's preferred way of doing things.
Perfectly. It reinforced the international norm that negotiations are the legitimate path, which is a huge soft power gain for Beijing across the entire region. Any success, even a temporary one, it validated Beijing's long-standing insistence that military pressure alone would never work.
Okay, and the third pillar. This touches on the internal status of Pyongyang, which is always so crucial for Beijing's security buffer.
Exactly. Number three, regime stability. China fears two things regarding North Korea: a war and a collapse. A collapse could lead to a unified, U.S.-aligned Korean peninsula and a massive security crisis on their border.
So the diplomatic process itself inherently secured the continuity of the North Korean regime.
Absolutely. As long as Kim Jong-un was being treated as a legitimate, high-level counterpart by the President of the United States, his regime's stability was guaranteed. Its existence was reaffirmed on the world stage.
So if all three of their core interests, peace, negotiation, and stability, were satisfied by the actions of other countries, the conclusion in Beijing must have been incredibly simple.
It was strategically elegant. The conclusion was, we are receiving maximum benefits without expending any diplomatic capital. They didn't need to use their leverage on Pyongyang to secure stability because Pyongyang was already securing it through dialogue with Washington.
Because events were flowing in a way that perfectly fit into China's national interest, they didn't need to stick their neck out to facilitate meetings or push for difficult compromises.
They simply let the existing momentum carry the diplomacy forward, which is the exact definition of getting what you want while keeping your hands clean. It's the ultimate realization of blowing your nose without using your hands.
The highest form of diplomatic efficiency. And that focus on stability, it's not just a strategic talking point for diplomats in Beijing, is it? It's a deeply practical, shared necessity that dictates policy, especially with South Korea.
It is the ultimate common denominator in Northeast Asia. It truly is. The need for a predictable security environment is what underpins so much of the bilateral relationship between China and the Republic of Korea. And we see this necessity illustrated perfectly in the real lives of people who depend on that cross-border stability.
You mentioned an anecdote about a South Korean entrepreneur, Mr. Park. Can you expand on his experience? He's in Shenyang, China. How does this high-level policy translate into the daily operations of a logistics firm?
All right. So Mr. Park has run his textile logistics firm in Shenyang for over 15 years. For him, the term strategic coordination isn't some abstract policy jargon. It's the literal day-to-day lifeline of his business. Shenyang is a crucial logistical hub, and the moment geopolitical tensions flare up,
the movement of goods becomes instantly precarious.
Instantly.
So what does that collective holding of breath actually look like on the ground for his business? I mean, does he see real decisions like canceling shipments being made based on a single hostile tweet or a North Korean missile test?
Oh, absolutely. He spoke of watching the Chinese state news channels constantly, not just for the content, but for the specific tone, the calculated calm that signals stability is holding.
Wow.
A change in rhetoric, even a hint of increased military drills, immediately translates into concrete business decisions. Trucking insurance premiums might spike, suppliers might refuse to sign cross-border contracts, or, most damagingly, his Chinese logistics partners might refuse to move inventory into certain regions for fear of border closures or disruptions.
So for his textile firm, China-RO coordination acts as a kind of silent shock absorber.
That's the perfect term for it. This quiet, almost bureaucratic agreement to maintain stability dampens the volatility. It ensures that trucks keep moving and contracts remain viable. The alternative, where the unthinkable becomes unavoidable, is just too costly for both sides' economic well-being.
That really puts the economic necessity in a sharp focus. And this imperative for stability, it goes beyond just commerce, right? It touches on the physical safety of people living right near the border.
It does. We also have the perspective of Li Hua, a young woman living in Yanji, which is right on the border in China's Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture.
Right.
For her and her community, the prevention of conflict isn't abstract. It's the physical safety of their homes, their schools, their entire way of life. Yanji has historically been affected by regional tensions, so that deep human layer of agreement between Beijing and Seoul on preventing conflict is incredibly important.
It strips away all the political rhetoric and gets down to the fundamental shared realization between these two governments.
And Li Hua articulates this so eloquently. She says the fundamental shared realization is that a fire in one house will burn the neighbors as well. If conflict erupts on the peninsula, the resulting crisis, whether it's through immediate fighting, a refugee influx, or economic collapse, it will not stop at the Yalu River.
So both Beijing and Seoul have this overwhelming shared interest in a predictable and peaceful security environment.
It's the strongest bridge in Northeast Asian diplomacy. It allows China's quiet, stabilizing role to align perfectly with South Korea's most urgent needs, even when they fundamentally disagree on the long-term geopolitical architecture of the region.
That creates such a fascinating dynamic. You have two countries that can be strategic rivals on one level, competing for regional influence, but at the same time, they are utterly dependent on each other for fundamental security on another level.
Precisely. They have a shared goal in the short-term stability, but their ultimate strategic destinations are entirely divergent. And this shared imperative for stability during the U.S. North Korea dialogue allowed China to achieve its goals while reserving its diplomatic capital for when it would truly be needed.
Okay, so China successfully observes the U.S. North Korea meeting. It sees its three main goals met: peace, negotiation, stability, and then the Hanoi Summit in 2019 collapses, just spectacularly.
Complete flameout.
And here's where that period of silence suddenly turns into an undeniable strategic advantage. What did Beijing immediately gain from that high-profile failure?
The collapse of Hanoi was interpreted in Beijing not as a diplomatic failure for the region, but as a critical validation of its own structural importance. It became a powerful, almost unavoidable lesson for all the regional stakeholders.
A validation that no lasting solution is possible if the negotiations bypass Beijing.
Exactly. Beijing interpreted the failure as a warning, loud and clear, to both Washington and Seoul. In the absence of Beijing, any long-term solution or comprehensive agreement will ultimately fail. It was an undeniable, tangible reminder of China's unique mediating role and its deep influence that had been intentionally sidelined during the direct U.S. North Korea talks.
And crucially, China had a clean alibi for the failure itself.
Yeah.
That allowed them to collect the strategic gain without incurring any of the blame.
And that clean alibi was a stroke of strategic luck, but it was also, I think, calculated communication. Kim Jong-un's train trip to Hanoi took 3 full days, crossing this vast expanse of Chinese territory. And yet, the Chinese media made a real point of noting that he did not stop over in Beijing for consultations with the Chinese leader, either before or immediately after the summit.
That non-stop over allowed Beijing to step back entirely from the outcome.
It provided them with a perfect diplomatic shield. They could conclude that the failure of Hanoi, the inability of the U.S. and North Korea to bridge that huge denuclearization gap, was entirely the fault of Washington and Pyongyang's bilateral missteps, not a result of Chinese interference or sabotage.
So they maintained their strategic posture as the necessary backstop, while completely avoiding any responsibility for the negotiations themselves.
Exactly.
And beyond the blame game, we talked about China achieving its stability goals automatically. Did the actual situation on the ground post-Hanoi really mirror China's long-term policy preference?
It absolutely did. Even though Hanoi collapsed without a formal agreement, the situation settled into a de facto realization of China's long-proposed solution, the freeze-for-freeze approach.
Okay, remind us what that is.
It's where North Korea largely maintained its moratorium on long-range missile and nuclear testing, which is a critical stability measure. In return, the U.S. significantly minimized its large-scale joint military drills with South Korea.
So even though the U.S. had formally rejected the freeze-for-freeze idea for years, China essentially got its preferred policy outcome achieved through, diplomatic stasis?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand why the U.S. had formally rejected that approach in the first place.
Right. What was the nuance there?
That nuance is absolutely crucial. China's proposed freeze-for-freeze was all about immediate risk reduction and stability. The U.S., on the other hand, was demanding CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization.
A much higher bar.
A fundamentally different goal. The American objection was about scope and legitimacy. While a testing freeze reduces immediate tensions, it leaves North Korea's underlying nuclear capability completely intact and, in a way, legitimized. From the U.S. perspective, accepting a freeze-for-freeze would have effectively validated North Korea's status as a nuclear state. That was a non-starter.
But post-Hanoi, the geopolitical inertia just pushed the region into that stable de facto freeze that China wanted anyway.
It did. It achieved Beijing's stability goals without them needing to formally endorse a position the U.S. rejected.
That is a huge return on zero formal investment. Now let's pivot to South Korea. Because while Beijing was succeeding through silence, Seoul was really struggling with the reality of its relationship with its giant neighbor. The ROK-China relationship had deteriorated pretty markedly from its high point.
Yes, the deterioration was stark. It was a descent from what was once described as a geopolitical honeymoon period.
And that honeymoon climaxed in 2015 when then-President Park Geun-hye attended China's massive military parade for the 70th anniversary of the victory over Japan Day.
I remember that image, standing right next to the Chinese leader. It was a colossal diplomatic signal, especially given that she was the only head of state from a major U.S. allied country to do so.
It was a very conscious diplomatic gesture by Seoul, though.
It was. South Korea viewed this engagement as buying diplomatic insurance. They made significant conciliatory gestures, attending the parade, joining the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and rapidly ratifying the bilateral free trade agreement.
All with the explicit expectation that China would repay them.
Right, repay them with active, hard cooperation on denuclearization and restraint against North Korea.
But when a subsequent nuclear test happened, the expected repayment just contained. It failed to materialize. And that led to crushing disappointment in Seoul.
It was a major political trauma. When North Korea conducted its fourth nuclear test in January 2016, President Park urgently called the Chinese leader for an emergency consultation. She viewed the issue as one demanding that strategic coordination they'd been promised.
And the call was reportedly not picked up, or at least significantly delayed.
And that singular moment served as a brutal wake-up call for Seoul. They realized their carefully constructed relationship, which was designed to leverage China's influence on Pyongyang, was not nearly as solid as they had hoped when it came to their core national security interests.
And the fallout over security decisions after that just intensified the strain. I'm thinking specifically about the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system.
The THAAD deployment marked the official shift into what South Korean analysts call the new normal, a period of strained neighbors rather than amicable partners. The U.S. South Korea alliance views the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, as necessary to protect against North Korean missiles.
But China views it as a direct threat to its own strategic depth and security.
Precisely. And China reacted not just diplomatically, but with comprehensive economic coercion. They essentially imposed unofficial sanctions. They banned Chinese tourist groups from visiting South Korea. They restricted South Korean cultural imports, K-pop, K-dramas.
And most famously, they shut down most of the Lotte Group's retail stores in China, because Lotte was the company that provided the land for the TA battery.
The economic cost to South Korea was estimated in the billions of dollars. And this episode violently demonstrated that for China, security and economics are inextricably linked. And that forced South Korea into this continuous strategic dilemma.
Which brings us to that enduring, almost impossible strategic debate in Seoul, the Anmi-Gyeongjong dilemma.
Anmi-Gyeongjong. It's a foundational concept in South Korean foreign policy. It literally translates to cooperate with the U.S. for security, China for economy.
And this is the strategic calculus that has defined Seoul's posture for decades.
It has. The U.S. alliance is seen as paramount. It's existential for security. Public favorability for the U.S. remains extraordinarily high. But at the same time, the economic necessity of China, their largest trading partner for over 2 decades, is equally indisputable.
And the public data shows a pretty clear split in priorities, right? Prioritizing the economy over security when dealing with Beijing.
The data is striking, yes. Surveys consistently show that around 70% of South Koreans prioritize improving economic relations with China. A much smaller percentage focuses on improving political and security relations. The public views the relationship as compartmentalized, almost solely focused on the bottom line.
But you mentioned that this strategy, Anmi-Gyeongjong, is increasingly seen as unsustainable by analysts in Seoul. Why is that?
It's seen as unsustainable because international politics, especially in a dynamic region like East Asia, rarely allows for such clean compartmentalization. Actions that Seoul defines as purely defensive security measures, like deploying THAAD or participating in U.S.-led security exercises, are immediately interpreted by Beijing as economic provocation.
And that leads to economic retaliation.
Exactly. So the rising economic and military asymmetry of China means that Seoul will eventually, it seems, be asked to choose between its primary security ally and its most important economic partner.
That is the core structural difficulty, isn't it?
It is. Analysts argue that China's rising economic and military might just intensify this dilemma. Beijing has increasingly used its economic weight as a foreign policy tool. The Fanchat retaliation showed Seoul that seeking security cooperation with the U.S. will almost certainly incur an economic penalty from China.
So relying on China for economic stability doesn't guarantee security cooperation.
It doesn't. In fact, many of the major initiatives that define that honeymoon period, like joining the AIIB or accelerating the FTA, were often initiatives started by Beijing. That put Seoul in this perpetual position of responding and then waiting for a repayment on core security issues that was fundamentally never going to come.
The Hanoi failure, then, really served as the period's ultimate lesson. China will prioritize its own 3 pillars of stability. And while that aligns with South Korea's immediate need for peace, it does not mean China will sacrifice its long-term strategic goals to achieve comprehensive denuclearization alongside the U.S. and the ROK.
A very hard lesson.
Okay, so let's leave the immediate aftermath of the Hanoi drama behind us and look forward to the current status of the China-ROK relationship here in 2025 and how Beijing is continuing to assert its strategic influence across the broader Asian region. Despite all those severe political headwinds, the core ROK-China economic relationship appears not only robust, but actively stabilizing.
It is undeniable. The economic relationship is the central stabilizing factor that prevents all the political disputes from boiling over entirely. China has maintained its position as South Korea's largest trading partner for 21 consecutive years.
21 years.
The scale of integration is massive. Bilateral trade volume reached nearly $299 billion in the first 11 months of 2025 alone.
Wow.
To put that figure in perspective, that scale of trade volume dictates a necessity for operational stability that just transcends political disagreements.
So integration is deeper than ever. What concrete steps are both sides taking in 2025 to make sure this robust trade continues and even evolves?
They're focused on upgrading the quality of the trade relationship. One key initiative is accelerating the second phase of their free trade agreement talks.
Okay, what's different about the second phase?
The original FTA was largely focused on goods, but the second phase is specifically aimed at promoting the services sector, things like finance, telecommunications, high-value logistics. This is crucial for South Korea, which has a highly developed services sector that it wants to export.
And beyond the FTA.
There's a significant move to revive the Bilateral Investment Cooperation Committee. This is a crucial dialogue that had been paused for 13 years following earlier political tensions. That revival signals a strong institutional commitment to deeper, more structured economic ties.
That 13-year pause really highlights the fragility of the relationship, but the revival signals a concerted effort to stabilize and grow. So where are we seeing the most dynamic cooperation in new high-growth sectors?
We're seeing a shift toward cooperation in sectors that are really going to define the future economy. We're talking about artificial intelligence, biopharmaceuticals, green industries, and the silver economy, which focuses on services for aging populations.
These are all areas where South Korea has immense technological capability, and China has that massive market scale.
It's a perfect match on paper.
Can you give us a tangible example of this green industry collaboration, something that shows this deep economic trust?
Certainly. Look at the biomass power project in South Korea's South Cheongcheong province. It involves CGN Energy International, which is a major Chinese state-owned enterprise.
Okay.
This project is a perfect illustration of deep green industry collaboration. The facility converts sustainable biomass into electricity. It's expected to generate 764 million kilowatt hours of clean electricity annually.
So it directly supports South Korea's ambitious renewable energy goals.
It does, while simultaneously helping China meet its broader economic engagement objectives in the region. It's a multi-billion-dollar investment that shows economic integration is not only persisting, but it's deepening into sensitive long-term infrastructure.
It's remarkable how that geopolitical competition can exist right alongside such deep, necessary economic interdependence. And it seems that people-to-people exchanges are also recovering from the earlier tensions. The phrase used was a rainbow after the rain.
That phrase really captures the necessary emotional repair of the relationship. The cultural and social bonds are stabilizing, and it's largely being driven by youth interest. We're seeing rising interest among young South Koreans in Chinese language and culture, which is being facilitated by renewed visa-free policies.
And of course, the panda tourism.
And of course, the incredibly popular phenomenon of panda tourism. With pandas often being loaned by China to zoos in allied or important partner countries, it acts as this informal diplomatic tool. This stabilization in social bonds provides essential ballast to the relationship. It helps ensure that political friction doesn't permanently damage the broader bilateral connection.
Okay, now let's widen the lens a bit. Beyond the peninsula, China is pushing very hard for technological self-reliance. This has massive implications for the global supply chain, and it's securing strategic access globally. Let's start with the push for technological leapfrogging, specifically in semiconductors.
Right. China's goal of achieving self-reliance in high technology is a foundational element of its long-term strategy, and semiconductor manufacturing is the absolute choke point. The most advanced chips rely on a technology called extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV.
And currently, the Dutch company ASML holds a virtual monopoly on the machines that do this, and Western trade restrictions have limited China's access to them.
That's right. And the EUV light source is the single most critical component in those machines.
So why is that specific technology so difficult to replicate?
Well, think of the EUV machine not just as a printer, but as a hyper-precise engraver. It's carving features onto silicon chips that are the size of just a few atoms. We're talking about features under 7 nanometers.
Unbelievably small.
The challenge is generating and then focusing the required light source, which is immensely difficult. It requires complex laser systems and highly advanced optics.
And the sources we're looking at indicate that PRT researchers have successfully created a prototype for an EUV light source platform. That progress sounds very accelerated.
It is significant, and it has certainly exceeded many Western projections. What's particularly telling is that this rapid progress was reportedly led by scientists, including the former head of light source technology at ASML itself.
So that demonstrates China's strategy of recruiting elite international talent to circumvent those technology restrictions.
It's very effective. Now, this prototype doesn't mean China will be mass manufacturing competitive advanced chips tomorrow. They still need the entire lithography toolchain. But it signifies a major step toward reducing external dependence and eventually challenging the global chip supply chain dominance that's currently held by South Korea and Taiwan.
Shifting from technological geography to physical geography, China is simultaneously focused on securing strategic global waterways. We saw a recent example of this involving the Panama Canal.
This incident with the Panama Canal ports, it clearly highlights China's unwavering commitment to maintaining influence over key global transit points, the strategic sea lines of communication that underpin all of global trade.
So Cosasco, the Chinese state-owned enterprise, reportedly demanded a majority stake in the sale of 2 critical ports of the canal that were going to be sold to BlackRock.
That's the report.
Why is controlling a majority stake so much riskier than just a minority stake in this context?
A majority stake grants operational control. And crucially, it grants access to maritime data and strategic influence over one of the world's most vital choke points. The risk is twofold. It's commercial and it's strategic.
Okay.
Commercially, COSCO gains huge leverage over global shipping routes. Strategically, given COSCO's affiliations, it introduces the potential for strategic denial or intelligence gathering regarding traffic flow through the canal. In a future geopolitical contingency, that would be extremely significant.
It reinforces the image that China is building this global network of strategic, economic, and logistical footholds.
Exactly.
And the pursuit of this strategic influence requires sophisticated diplomatic balancing acts in other volatile regions, too. It really illustrates China's ability to maintain these complex international relationships, even when facing criticism from its own strategic partners.
We saw a fascinating demonstration of this diplomatic agility recently in the Middle East. It concerned the territorial dispute between the UAE and Iran over 3 islands near the Strait of Hormuz. When the PRC Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed the issue, China expressed support for the UAE's efforts to peacefully resolve the issue.
Now, that position seems to put China in a really difficult spot with Iran, which is a key strategic partner for them, and a major oil supplier.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
Iranian officials and state media openly criticized China. They accused Beijing of maintaining a double standard on territorial sovereignty, especially when you compare it to China's very stringent stance on its own domestic sovereignty issues.
But China is balancing these immense and competing economic interests.
They are. While Iran is a critical source of oil and a strategic partner, the UAE and the other Gulf Cooperation Council states, the GCC, are immense targets for PRC investment, infrastructure projects, and they act as key re-export hubs for Chinese goods. China is committed to deepening economic ties with the GCC, and supporting the UAE's position on peaceful resolution, while acknowledging the complexity, is a necessary balancing act to secure those massive long-term economic gains.
And while they're balancing interests abroad, China is simultaneously pushing back against security developments closer to home, particularly what it perceives as military expansion by Japan.
This is a consistent theme in Beijing's regional security narrative. The PRC has voiced strong criticism regarding Japan's plans to expand its military presence on remote islands, specifically the deployment of mobile warning and control radar units on islands like Kitadaido Island.
And Japan insists these deployments are purely defensive responses to increased air and maritime activities by neighboring countries.
That's the official line from Tokyo.
So how does China frame these actions beyond just the standard accusation of military expansion?
Beijing frames these actions as establishing a network of pretexts for broader military expansion. And crucially, as strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance's ability to respond quickly to regional contingencies, particularly near the Taiwan Strait.
Ah.
China consistently argues that these radar units and deployments are not merely defensive observation posts. They argue they're part of a larger plan to integrate Japan's military into a U.S.-led regional security architecture. And they push back hard against what they view as an infringement on their regional influence and security. This sustained criticism really highlights China's commitment to managing regional military tensions and countering any moves that bolster U.S. allied positions in Asia.
So if we bring this all together,
to synthesize the central theme of this entire deep dive, China's period of strategic silence during the height of U.S. North Korea diplomacy was, arguably, one of the most effective, low-cost diplomatic moves in recent Northeast Asian history.
It seems so.
It confirmed to all the major parties that China's core interests, stability, negotiation, and regime security, could be met without any direct Chinese expenditure of diplomatic capital. The entire period showcased China's shift from a player that felt the need to be reactive to one that is proactively comfortable allowing events to serve its interests.
This approach emphasized stability above all else.
And in doing so, it effectively cemented the narrative that no lasting or comprehensive solution on the peninsula is possible without Beijing's long-term, continuous strategic engagement.
That really brings the full arc of the story together beautifully. We started with that idiom, blowing your nose without using your hands, and we've seen how China executed that perfectly on the security front.
Right.
And while South Korea and China can celebrate a stabilization in their economic and social relationship in 2025, and they genuinely share that immediate, urgent goal of preventing conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the core motivations for their cooperation remain fundamentally different and, fundamentally difficult to reconcile.
And that's the final thought to leave you with. China is primarily aiming for the deep restructuring of the regional order, positioning itself as the central stabilizing force and rule-maker in East Asia. We see that in its technological push and its global strategic acquisitions.
Meanwhile, South Korea is primarily seeking economic security and the maintenance of a stable status quo on the peninsula to protect its alliance and its vital economic interests.
And these differing ultimate destinations mean that even when they're traveling together on the shared path of stability and cooperation, that cooperation is constantly underpinned by friction driven by fundamentally divergent strategic goals.